Happy Friday, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nishant, Bhajaria, and I'm here for the session titled Making Trustworthy AI a Business Advantage. We've talked a lot about privacy over the last couple of days, and before I introduce my panel, you'll see an AI team day where we talk about making AI work better for people who are on privacy. That's what the session's about. But before we jump into details, I would love to get the panel to introduce themselves. Vasudha, you want to go first, Vasudha?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Vasudha. I'm a senior privacy program manager with DoorDash. I come from a consulting background. I was working for 5 years in cybersecurity and privacy consulting. A couple of years before DoorDash in TikTok, where I was a privacy program manager as well. I was handling incident response. I was handling data subject rights requests, and a lot of other data governance programs. But yeah, I've been at DoorDash for close to 2.5 or almost 3 years now, and been working with data governance. Been leading the AI governance initiative at DoorDash, and yeah, it's been interesting. It's been an interesting time to be in the space, but I'm really looking forward to this panel.
Thank you. Conor, you want to go next?
Thanks, Nishant. Conor Hogan. I'm the Commercial Director and Go-to-Market Architect at BSI Group's Consulting Division. I mainly focus on cybersecurity and privacy advisory services, and the architect in my job title really refers to how we architect services and solutions for our clients' needs. And an awful lot of the last probably 5 or 6 years is centered around risk and, I suppose, compliance challenges around AI, and specifically the privacy and security challenges therein. But my background historically has been information security, outsourced DPO, and global privacy program development and management. So really pleased to be here today, and to echo Vasudha's points, really looking forward to this panel discussion today.
Thank you. George?
Hi everyone, George Jones. I work at ZoomInfo as their data protection officer. ZoomInfo is a B2B data provider with a lot of AI-enabled technology built into its platforms. So quite an exciting topic for me. And this is actually the second time I spoke on a panel alongside Conor. So excited to be back.
Good to hear. So let's just jump right in. And before I ask the question for the audience, we have a Q&A tab. We would love to take your questions. I cannot promise we can take them all, given that it's only 30 minutes, but we would love to incorporate your thoughts into the discussion as well. So please have the questions come in. So the first question is, what does it mean for an AI solution to be trustworthy? Like, we have not really defined trust in a universal sort of way. So what does it mean for an AI solution to be such that our end user can trust it? So Vasudha, you want to try that first?
Yeah. So I think that making sure that the AI solution does exactly what it says, is reliable. There's no funny business going on in the background. It's doing exactly what it's intended to do. It's using the data that it should be using. It's not having any bias, or even if there is bias, it's intended bias. It's not, bias is not always a bad word. If it's intentional, if that is the reason that if it's like a personalization, then a little bit of bias is probably intended. But I think basically just doing what it says, I think, is the simplest way to put it, so that there's no thoughts about is this using any data, is there any ethical concerns about it, is there any privacy concerns about it, are there security transfers going to other places where we don't know where the data is going, or are you procuring data from a third party where we don't even know that you have access to that data. So I would say, simply put, that would be my definition of what it means to be trustworthy.
I love the intentional bias. We love what you said, Vasudha, because you want to make sure that you know what the models are doing. It seems obvious, but it's obvious until it punches you in the face. So thanks for making that point. George, you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, I think Vasudha's point there was very good. I think it's also worth paying a lot of attention to the data that's feeding into these models to give you an output as well. There's a big difference between using sort of first party data that you're feeding in to give you a direct inference compared to a model that could be pulling data from elsewhere, right? So in the case of ZoomInfo, we may have data coming into a model that we host from a customer CRM, which is obviously really great first party data, but there will be points that we supplement that with the third party data that we have in our business to business database, essentially. So getting the balance right between the first party data and make sure that it interacts with the third party data well enough to give you a viable outcome is is really important for us, and making sure that data is handled appropriately as well, right? Like we're quite clear with our customers that we don't train models based on customer data, right? Any data that they feed in is only used to provide them with an output. It's not used to train a model. So transparency and building trust there is really essential for us.
Great call out there, Conor.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting in this context, Nishant, and really good answers from Vasudha and George as well, is actually what is trust. And for the longest time, trust has been this abstract term that we've bandied about, whether it's in the security industry, subsequently the privacy industry, and now very much in the AI industry. And I think fundamentally trust is made up of a number of different things. And I think in an AI context, we're probably all agreed in general that a trustworthy AI solution is something that's fair, transparent, secure, accountable, and versions thereof. But actually, if you think about what trust is at its fundamental level, it was typically like word of mouth. And to this day, word of mouth is still a big enabler for trust. Whether it's in a community setting, at a domestic setting, in a local setting, where you might, think of eons ago where you borrow a tool from a neighbor. That still happens because you know them and trust them. And that human interaction of trustworthiness is something that we're finding very difficult to replicate, I think, in this digital age. And then this terminology of digital trust sort of arrived on the scene a number of years ago. And that's a very abstract term around, maybe trusting the interaction that people have with data, with digital things, with technology, or even physical devices, but in the digital space. And we've moved from local trust to institutional trust, whether it's of government and of big business and big tech, into a more distributed nature of trust now in the last number of years. And actually, when we talk then, we shift another step forward. We're actually beginning to think about, well, how can we trust autonomous systems and specifically AI tools and AI solutions to make decisions that are critically independent, perhaps free of bias, as Vasudha said, that is built on trustworthy data and is ethical and does that in a transparent way. So I don't think, when I think about the question, like, and what does trustworthiness mean for AI solutions? And that's a big challenge today, because fundamentally there are very different jurisdictional, regional expectations, even local expectations as to what trust is. So the hallmark of trust typically is something that you can have faith in, but it becomes very, very personal very, very quickly. And I think that's a big challenge.
And again, Conor, excellent point. I love how you begin with like working with your neighbor and then you go to AI. The scale is huge. So how do you essentially have the neighborliness? How do you have the intimacy that comes from trust at that human level? And how do you bring that to sort of something as huge as AI? Which gets me to my next question, which is, how do you convince? I'm sure all of you in your businesses are in your lives are looking at AI stakeholders. These folks want to like get with the LLMs, move fast, personalize things, etc. And they feel like they're in competition with any number of things like DeepSeek or whatever, right? So you don't want to like unnecessarily like slow them down. You don't want to like create a bureaucracy in a useless way. But it is also in these early days that big mistakes are made. Like you screw things up and then years down the road something bad happens. It's very hard to reverse engineer it, right? So how are you balancing? How are you making sure that you can innovate and bring that collaborative approach, but also make sure that your teams don't step on their own feet? So how do you find that balance? Conor, I'll start with you this time.
I should have run a book on how quickly we'd mentioned the term balance, but it is really a difficult thing to do, because innovation is, let's mess around and find out, or let's move fast and break things. But actually, we're talking about data that is representative of individuals typically, and that's where the privacy conversation is very, very significant. And I'm speaking to you from Ireland, a member state of the EU, very, very focused on regulation, some might argue, to the detriment of innovation historically, and maybe still to this day. And I think fundamentally it becomes a constituent element of the innovation plans that you have is how do we carefully innovate without stifling things? And I wish I had a simple catch-all phrase or mantra, Nishant, that solves it, but it really is a balance. It's about risk and taking concerted decisions that are founded in, shock, horror, data. And trust really is, I think, the difference in success and failure, regardless of the technology. And you know, maybe just to expand on that point slightly before my colleagues come in, but I think adoption of, you know, solutions is one thing. Regulatory and legal risk in terms of how quickly you can make things versus break things is something that people in different parts of the world have different appetites for, and that's a really welcome thing, I think. And then obviously there's the internal buy-in, so it's a balance of all of those factors. But I think if you think of all of that, well, customer adoption, regulatory legal risk, internal buy-in, and just appetite, trust isn't a nice to have. It's key to unlocking AI's full potential. And some evidence of how maybe not to do it, we've seen in the past, you know, number of weeks, for instance, with very, very significant customer adoption of certain tools, and then a big regulatory backlash. So it is a balance, and it's something that I think we have to be constantly alert to and willing to push the boundaries of, and then roll back, you know, not necessarily brinksmanship, but the appetite to do things, challenge the status quo. And that's where innovation is at its best.
Great call out. George, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think Conor's point around like internal approach is very important here, right? So having a sensible default that everybody is working towards and a common goal and common objective is super important for me. It's an impossible job as a privacy person or a compliance person to keep everybody within your organization happy all the time, right? So I think for me, the most important part of my job is setting some boundaries, some sensible defaults where people can just run, right? These are your parameters. If you're within these goalposts, just run with it. Just go. Like, come to us if you need help, but like these are our sensible defaults. This is how we would normally approach things. If you're on the borderline, if you're outside of those goals, then we need to change our approach here and change our tactic. But working with the board, working with senior leadership, working with cross-functional teams, so especially in AI, right? Working with security, working with your technology function, working with even your sales teams to understand customer expectations and customer wants and customer needs, and having that picture so you're not just running and building a product that you think is great, but at the end of the day isn't going to tick the boxes from a legal regulatory perspective, isn't actually solving a problem that your customers are looking to solve. You know, that's where I focus here. Put it in the voice of the customer, account for the risk, because of course that's our job. But if we can relate it back to a customer need or a customer want, and then try and figure out a way to get there that works for all of these teams and all of these requirements, then that's the way I would go.
Great call out. And Vasudha, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, completely aligned with everything that Conor and George said. I don't think that governance can really work in isolation. It cannot be, you know, only the privacy or the AI governance team or whatever you want to call it. Whoever is you know, keeping the toes in line in your company, they cannot work in isolation. They need, you know, partnership with engineers. They need partnership with MLEs or you know, whoever is the maybe the client of the third party solution that they're buying, or you know, whoever is the developer of the internal solution they're building. Everyone needs to be aware of what is acceptable, what is not. And acceptable is, again, coming from like 3 different companies. I know that acceptable is very different in each of these companies. There is a different risk appetite. There's a different risk threshold that each company has. It's important to define your own risk threshold. Maybe you want to you know, experiment a little. Maybe you think that, okay, you can experiment within the boundary that you set. It could be a wider boundary when you know, you want to actually push for innovation, and that's not, again, it's not a bad thing. You can experiment also. There are experimentation ways with dummy data and all of that. You don't have to, you know, do the most you know, rigorous testing on real data. But you can you know, set your own risk threshold, whatever works for you, and then, you know, see that you're not hampering innovation in any way. But also it's important to make sure everyone is aware of what you're trying to get to. Everyone is aware of you know, regulations. Everyone is aware of your, you know, obligations towards customer data. Everyone is aware of your obligations towards privacy, towards maintaining transparency, towards maintaining accountability. Everyone needs to be aware of it from the get-go. It's always it's always very, very difficult to do it after the fact, after an entire model has been developed or after an entire use case has been developed. It's much more irritating to people to go in and then say that, we need to change things. Rather get everyone involved right at the beginning. If you're all in one company, there's no competition between teams. That I'm assuming, to say that, this is something that I'm building. So get everyone on the same board and you start privacy reviews. This is what it's called, privacy by design, or AI governance by design is what it is now. So just make sure everyone is on the same page right at the get-go.
Yeah. And I love a point Conor made. Good point, Vasudha, as well. Conor, you said something interesting about how a lot of companies onboarded some tools, and then there was a backlash. It brings to mind a quote from Bobby Kennedy back in the day. He said, "We build our castles on the edge of the seashore, and the tides of change roll in." So you often have to be ready for those partnerships, because it's very hard, to Vasudha's point, to go back and build those relationships, because it's very hard to reverse engineer AI. Like, we learned that lesson in privacy and security over the last decade. So it's much more challenging with AI because the data is so much bigger, adoption is so much faster, right? So yeah.
And I think the challenge is exemplified even in the AI context, because we don't really know what harms will be done or could be done in the future. Yes, it's a huge amount of data, and there are privacy considerations there. And maybe it's the European perspective that I have, and sort of the regulatory scrutiny that is typically follows innovation and the rollout of new technology here in Europe. But it's very hard, once the cat is out of the bag, to claw them back in. And I think the harms that can be done or may be done, and I know we're talking in sort of the abstract, in terms of possibilities and future developments. But I really think that we're on a collision course with harms, to society at large, not just in a jurisdictional perspective or a localized area. I think we're on a collision course with significant harms to be done to society at large that we just aren't ready for. We don't have the mechanisms to manage. We don't have the political will, perhaps, or even the societal constructs to be able to deal with it. But, it's not, I'm not talking black swan or, like chaos, but then again, there's a chance that could happen, So without scaremongering, I think we're just in very interesting times.
I think there's a huge difference between like build and buy here as well, right? Like,
oh yeah,
there's a massive difference if you're a company that's building your own models compared to buying and then making them fit into a solution that you're developing, right? I think if you're building models from the ground up, there's far much more burden on you in terms of bias mitigation, management of training data. But then if you're buying a solution and then building on top of that, right? So you're using OpenAI, like APIs and things, right? And you're just building prompts to go on top. Do you have full control over that? Do you really understand like where the bias is introduced into their models, and where's the control, right? Does that live with you as the person who's building on top of that, or like where's the liability? This is another thing that we have to consider, and something that I think, and I come across like AI risk assessments all the time, and I'm sure you guys do too, right? And the maturity there at the moment, we've got some companies who are very focused on AI as a risk, but then their risk is very focused on the development of AI, but then they're sort of avoiding the question if they're just deploying a third-party solution. And I just feel like that's a gap that the industry needs to tighten up at the moment. It is something that I definitely have to concentrate on a lot within ZoomInfo.
So you want to add anything to that before I move
on? No, I think
yeah.
I completely
And I want the audience to understand something very clearly. Like, we have gone back and forth. We went with an FTC that was very, very highly aggressive to a regime that is not very regulation friendly. So it's very hard to go back and forth once every 2 or 4 years, right? You cannot suddenly build for governance. So trust is important, because you can bring trust and make it about efficiency, make it about productivity, make it about transparency, make it about a feature set, right? So trust gives you the ability to build for future compliance as well, right? It's very hard to re-engineer for compliance back in the day. So it's very hard, to George's point, build the LLM correctly and then go back and find out that there was bias that you missed, right? So trust is important, not just as an abstraction or something that's so nice to have. It is a down payment on compliance challenges that are also coming down the road. So I just want to, if you guys have issues winning your support within the company right now, lean on trust as a way to build that case for your AI models, because that's coming. I guess my next question is, what if you were to think of a nightmare scenario, like what if there are people in the audience wondering, how do you make the case? Like how do you point out about a potential harm that could be coming on the road? Like, could we have an example or two that would be very helpful? Conor, you go first.
Well, I think as an example, we could catastrophize, right? But actually, I think it's more what we do with our customers, especially on the consulting side of our business, and we also have a regulatory services division in BSI where we're awaiting accreditation as an AI notified body under the EU AI Act. There are things like being able to demonstrate how trust. So rather than sort of catastrophizing things in terms of risk, I would nearly flip it on its head and say, look at how privacy, how trust in AI should be a strategic priority for the business. And Vasudha mentioned AI governance, and we're talking about ethical frameworks and ethical governance approaches to building things that will work in a constructed, managed manner. Like fundamentally, I think it comes down to risk, right? And being able to educate the people who are making decisions on what is being done with the data today or what might be done with the data in the future, and setting reasonable boundaries. And I think there's a really interesting question in the chat there about, what boundaries are there? And I suppose those boundaries should be established with risk in mind, with liability, like George mentioned, within the backdrop of, well, what could go wrong? Not just what could go wrong from a regulatory perspective, and will we get our hands slapped by some regulator at some point in the future, but actually from a people perspective, we're talking about maybe physical harms as much as digital harms or logical harms that could be done to individuals from a privacy perspective. And we could go root and branch on the SLO framework, or go down the Calo model, or any of those existing frameworks with regard to harms that can be done to people. But actually, I think from an impact perspective, some of the biggest and simplest, maybe the scariest questions that execs or developers or engineers don't want to face is, well, how would your parents feel? How would your kids feel? How do you explain this to people who aren't invested in the technology like you are? I mean, how would they feel? How would your customers feel today to find out that their most intimate data about their most intimate aspects of their lives are being used in this purpose or to achieve this goal? And fundamentally, then you tie all that back to risk and tie it back to trust being the strategic priority as an enabler for the business. That's a very difficult conversation, though, because let's face it, developers, engineers, we just want to get stuff done, and so we're back to that balancing equation. So how do we balance the innovation versus the I suppose the administrative burden that is risk? That's a challenge.
What's the one next?
Yeah, just to add on to one of the points that Conor mentioned, I think it all comes down to data and having data hygiene. It's good to we all know about machine learning, but unlearning is that much more difficult. If you never had the right to or the purpose specified of the data that you're collecting, you've never said that you're going to be using it for like training your AI tools. You've never said that you're going to be using it to train your ML models. Removing that data from some system that has already learned so much about about you from that from your data that you've never given permission to use is that much more difficult. And I think it comes down to having the data hygiene, having set expectations of how data will be used, what it's collected for, and not really make things chaotic in terms of data. You need to have your separation of I'm collecting it for this specific reason, I'm collecting it for marketing reasons, I'm collecting it for training my AI data. And it's okay to specify that you want to use this for training AI tools, and have the user control that, have them say that I allow it or I don't allow it, and go by what you're saying, or go by what they're saying, or and how they want to control their data. So I think that is a sort of nightmare scenario for me, where I see that there are a lot of companies trying to play catch up now with data governance, and they're trying to understand, okay, where did all this data come from? We came here like 6 years ago, and now we have all of this data. We never knew what terms people are accepting when they provide us their data. Are we now allowed to use this for AI? Are we now allowed to use this for training our AI models? the answer should be no. It's not by default yes. And so that, I think, is a nightmare scenario for me when you've assumed that the answer is yes, you've trained your models, and now you have to somehow undo all of that, which is not an easy task when it's like years of iteration. When a model is learning from data, it's not easy to just remove the data and say that okay, we've unlearned from that data. No, it doesn't work that way.
Totally. And we're down to the last like 4 minutes. I want to end with one quick question here. I believe, I'm a recovering PM, so I always thought of how do I make sure that my team gets credit for the work we did, because if you don't get credit, people don't stay in your team much longer. So with privacy, when you build for trust, you can showcase a dashboard with the customer, and hopefully they'll consent a lot more, won't hit you with a DSAR, right? There are wins to be had with trust. How do you make the case to your customer that you have optimized for trust, and therefore make the case to your business that trust is a good investment? How do you do that? Because it's very easy to like optimize for trust in AI, but very hard to showcase trust. So how do you, any ideas? I'm sure the audience would want to hear that as well. So they will go next.
Yeah, I think all of the following. I mean, I think we've all discussed, having proper processes for collecting data, making sure that you're saying that it's not going to be used for anything else. You sort of establish the trust from the conception of your model itself. When you use your, I mean, when you conceive your model, when you start building your model, make sure that you say that you're not using any data. It's only been trained on dummy data, or it's only been trained on data that was explicitly collected for this purpose and with user consent. Second, if there is any model that's running, it's in production, it's running, and it's powering some of your tools like your chatbots or something like that on your websites. You say that these models have been reviewed, they have been assessed properly, they have been the results have been vetted. Or you always specify that there's a human also reviewing some of these answers and outputs that come out of it. I think that that human element, the idea that it's not an AI system that's working alone in isolation and hasn't been touched for years, hasn't been reviewed for years, is always comforting to people. And also you have to specify the benefits of it. There is a reason that you're using an AI tool. It's not to lose customers. It is to make your product better. It's to get more accurate results. It's to get more efficient results, to get quicker results. That's why you are using AI tools. And specifying those benefits to customers, I think, helps develop that trust. So I think those are like key points that I would think of when I want to communicate trust.
Yeah, I think for me, like, there's one way I look at this is transparency by default, right? Like that's the way I want all businesses to move towards. If you're transparent with the pros of this processing, the pros of this AI modeling, like if you explain what the benefits are, whilst also bringing attention to the potential risks and helping the customer realize the harm, which then helps them realize the risk and humanize that, I think that is the sort of benefits of being open, and that leads to trustworthiness, right? If you are open by default, if you're transparent, if you help the customer realize what their potential risks are, they're more likely to trust you and move forward with your products, solutions, tools, you name it.
Yeah, I really like that, George. Transparency by default, because it mirrors the concept of explainability by design. And I think I think at the heart of this entire discussion is a really simple truth, which is that AI, whatever form it takes, is only ever going to be as powerful as the trust that people have in it. And there's been enough science fiction written about how, all sorts of technology is going to take over the world. Okay, fine. So how do we avoid that situation, even just the optics of that situation? And I think the organizations that treat trust as a strategic advantage, not just a compliance requirement or a regulatory thing, will be the ones that will drive success in adoption. They will gain competitive advantage and edge, and fundamentally you're going to future-proof their AI strategies, because let's face it, we're on the cusp of like fundamental change in technology and how we experience things, how we create, how we are creative, even as a race. But fundamentally, trust doesn't happen by accident. It may have done in the past, to a certain degree, and I think we're in a sort of a default, maybe a default sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? we're of the default expectation that just because we have a good idea that it's going to work and people will trust in it. I don't think we're there as a society, global society anymore. I think there's a general skepticism in things that people see, in the news that people consume, in the appetite that people have in general for new technologies as well. So trust will not happen by accident. And I think when I'm talking to my clients and they're both on the development side and on the deployment side and on the regulatory side, it's about deliberate choice. Make it transparent, make it explainable, make it fair, not just efficient, although obviously that's important. Put privacy and security at the core, and the choice to engage people, users, regulators, and just broad stakeholders in that conversation. It serves society, not just commercial interests. That's, I think, where the focus should be, because trust is no longer... Trust isn't cost, it's the currency almost of AI's future.
And there is the quote right there, not the cost for the currency. And that's going to be on the PR materials once this event is done. So mic drop right there. And this has been a great panel. Thank you folks so much.